Good event so far, I think, and it's exciting to see some of what's been happening in terms of the realization of the third network with MEF 3.0. And so what I wanted to do was maybe put it into a somewhat broader context on the idea of the third network and how that aligns with what I refer to as the third digital wave. Digital wave. What does that mean? If you Google it, you'll get some hits. They're not exactly consistent. So let me tell you how I use the term. It's an evolution, and we can think about it as maybe the first wave starting sort of in the early 90s with the establishment of a pervasive internet, largely over fixed line connectivity and kind of connecting sort of low volume applications. You might consider the killer app in that regard sort of being email, for instance. And the network was built a certain way with a certain capability, a certain reach, a certain capacity to support that. The second wave started maybe in the mid-2000s, a little bit later. And in my mind, what characterized that a lot was this idea of the smartphone and the idea of a mobile internet. And in particular, the introduction of the concept of an app. There's an app for everything. It really started changing the way we were consuming information. Not only the type of information, but the fact that we could do that on the run or on the go. And we're kind of there in the second wave, and on the cusp of, I think, really entering the third wave. And this, I think, really is about really the explosion of the possibility of some incredibly transformative applications, or I'd even call them experiences, personal life, professional life experiences, some of which are kind of already underway. Right? I think we'll all have examples in our minds of many of these things I'm going to talk about now. But I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg of what all of this experience is going to mean to us moving forward. Certainly we're all on social media, one form or another, probably multiples of those. But I think we can continue to see, if you think about 3 years back, what a social media experience was like compared to today. It's much more immersive, it's much more real time, it's much more high bandwidth, it's much more collaborative. And that's just going to continue. The digital life transformation is going to continue to erode the concept of walls or physical locations. Again, think 3 years back and what it was like to collaborate with your coworkers, within an office, but now we can do that virtually from anywhere we are with some excellent collaboration tools. And so this brick and mortar concept really continues to sort of virtualize itself, if you will. Media. Of course, getting higher bandwidth, higher resolution. But the thing that's interesting to me is now it's really transitioning to much more of a two-way experience. We can interact with media in ways that we weren't able to before. And that's just going to continue more and more. The consumption is really going to become more of a two-way street. And speaking of consumption, whether you call it e-consumption or m-consumption or a bit of both, the way we do commerce, the way we consume government services, health services, learning services. We can all see this trend is happening, that this is becoming more and more online into a virtualized environment whenever we want it from whatever device we happen to be carrying. Our lives are getting digitally enhanced, and I'll give an interesting example about augmented reality and a shopping experience. Digitally enhanced travel, digitally enhanced shopping, digitally enhanced recreation. And of course, another one that I think we're all pretty familiar with is this idea of a smart environment. Our homes, our offices, our factories, our cities, the smart world, if you will. So yeah, some of this is already happening, and I know there's been a lot of conversation about it, but again, I will put to you that we're just at the beginning of what this is really going to be able to do for us moving forward. That's what I mean by the third digital wave. In all of these apps, and again, you can think about them more as experiences than apps, they have some things in common. They're going to be delivered from common environments. Certainly they're going to be sourced from the cloud. And the nature of that cloud, as we've already heard a couple of our speakers talk about, is changing. But this is where this goodness is going to be coming from. And because it's coming from the cloud, we're going to consume it increasingly in a portable and a nomadic way in models that are really self-service or on demand. We kind of already do that to a degree. You can just imagine that's going to continue. These apps are going to be complex in terms of what they can deal with us. It's more than just let me connect people or connect me to some content. It's going to be let me churn some information and actually adapt or adjust the experience I'm going to get. It's going to be about adding machine learning and artificial intelligence and other cognitive systems into the mix so that any one of these apps is really going to be able to do something really cool, tailored to us and changing real time. And then finally, the way we interact with this environment is going to change. You could almost ask yourself the rhetorical question, how many generations beyond our kids are really going to learn how to, or need to learn how to use a QWERTY keyboard and a computer monitor to interact with technology? And this is going to be much more immersive, it's going to be much more media rich, and it's going to be much more of a sensory experience. And of course, all of this, you can't really have that conversation without at least throwing out the buzzword of Internet of Things. So much of this is going to be delivered against the backdrop of the Internet of Things. This is the environment that we're moving to. It's exciting stuff. I, as a vendor, I'm going to be talking to a lot of my provider customers and say, this is where I believe you're going to make your money moving forward, is in these kinds of experiences and applications that you're going to deliver. I, as a vendor, also think, well, how would I build a network that's going to suit that problem statement into the third digital wave? What's going to have to change about the network? Quite a lot. But in the time I've got allotted, really, I'm just going to highlight 3 things. First, I think the ecosystem that delivers these experiences, we're going to see is going to have to be much more functionally distributed than it has in the past. And so logically, that's going to mean connectivity patterns and topologies in the network are going to have to change and accommodate for that. The nature of infrastructure is going to have to change, and I think there was some very interesting commentary on the previous session, for instance, about security has to be a fundamental part of an infrastructure. Cloud and compute resources have to be a fundamental part of the infrastructure, and yes, the network also has to be a fundamental part of that infrastructure. But we need to be thinking about those things wrapped together as really a unified platform upon which these applications can live, and that's going to introduce new orchestration requirements and coordination requirements. And then finally, I just frankly don't believe that there's going to be one company, one technology provider, when you think about these applications, the scope and the reach of them, they can build it all themselves. This is going to have to be delivered out of a heterogeneous ecosystem of providers and technology vendors really working together, and that's going to really put the emphasis on how do you communicate, what sort of APIs are going to be necessary in order for that to work. By way of just a little more detail then, let's look at an example, right? And this example would be an augmented reality enhanced shopping experience. So think of me entering a grocery store, a supermarket, being able to walk down the aisles of the supermarket, holding up my smartphone, seeing a live video of the aisle that I'm walking on there, but having offers or sales or coupons presented to me, superimposed on my device real time as I walk down there, customized to me. What would I need to put together in order to make that experience possible? Speaking to the functional distribution piece of it, yeah, there's going to be some amount of functionality that'll be centralized and some amount of functionality that's going to have to be more local, almost to the in-store context. From a centralized perspective, yeah, maybe the grocery store chain is going to have a central data repository, a central data center where they keep information about me. They keep my profile, they keep my buying habits, they keep my preferences or maybe what I tend to buy as groups. And similarly, they may have a comprehensive information base around the products that they're offering, maybe some windows in which they can offer some pricing flexibility, these sorts of things, all backed with analytics engines to kind of be able to synthesize more and more information about me and about the products and be able to marry those together. So some sort of a centralized processing, very funky font, but centralized processing engine there that'll build a set of information that says at the time that Karl walks into that store, this might be the set of offers that would be of interest to him. Now, the thing is, in this application, I obviously won't be able to access that from a centralized data store or a centralized synthesized information set if it's fully centralized. I need something closer to me. I need something in the store. So you can imagine that at a very basic level, you need to cache. Once you've built that information center, you need to cache it closer to where I actually am. And there needs to be some processing where I'm standing, right? There has to be some location tracking. What aisle am I on? Some information about where the inventory in that particular store currently sits and how low or how high that inventory is. Putting that all together, rendering some video that I'm providing, rendering some augmented reality superimpositions on that, and then delivering it back to my device. And all of that has to happen with pretty much a real-time experience. So that speaks to the fact that this application lives in multiple places. And so when we talk about then the infrastructure that's got to be there in order to make this happen, again, it's more than just a network. There needs to be a security element that sort of recognizes who I am and admits me into the system. And that's got to work really across the localized as well as the centralized resource areas. There has to be a compute fabric, and that compute fabric really needs to look unified, and it will have to be distributed. There are going to have to be edge cloud resources for the in-store processing. There's going to have to be core or regional resources for some of the centralized processing. And of course, there needs to be a coordinated network fabric that kind of stitches all of that together. And some of that network fabric is local in context, so it may be me on the mobile broadband connection or in the in-store Wi-Fi. But there's also an element of this network fabric, clearly, which is about connecting the store to the data center or interconnecting multiple data centers. That's a pretty big job to put all of that together and make it work seamlessly. Which takes me to the point that it's hard to imagine that any one person or any one entity is going to be able to do that by themselves. Right, so you build these sorts of applications, you can envision there's going to be the application provider or the content provider, if you will. There's going to be a network provider or multiples of those. There'll be cloud providers, whether they're cloud exchange or cloud infrastructure providers. There'll be technology providers, maybe people who provide analytics engines or CDN capability or security capability. And all of these are going to have to interconnect in order to deliver that application. Probably in a data center and probably in a hierarchical set of data centers. And so the model here is already moving to, but has to continue to move towards, they exchange capability with each other, they request capability from each other, they deliver capability with each other very much in an everything as a service model. And that, of course, includes the network. Establishing that common network fabric is really going to put the emphasis on we've got to make sure that the APIs that drive network as a service are well understood, well accepted, and they deliver on the functionality that are required, both to connect the user into the cloud-based application as well as to interconnect the cloud infrastructure over a WAN or a data center interconnect. So again, it's going to put some interesting pressures on the network, some interesting changes on the network. What would those be? A lot of text on this slide, but let me just summarize it for you. I kind of see some major themes. First, this network has to fit that environment where it's underpinning these cloud-based applications that are going to be functionally distributed across a hierarchy of localized resources and core resources. Yeah, the network's going to have to continue to deliver on scale, but there's actually a couple of dimensions to the scale. There's the raw capacity. This is something that Ciena does quite a lot of, but there's also endpoint scale. Now we're talking about IoT and other types of environments like that are going to cause an explosion in the number of endpoints that need to actually connect to the network. And these endpoints can be people, users, devices, systems, servers, other machines. And the network has got to adjust to that sort of a topology and that sort of a flexibility. In my example, it would be awful if I was rendering a video for an aisle that I passed to 10 minutes ago. So response time and quality of experience is going to be incredibly important, and that leads us to the concept of hierarchical clouds and edge compute. I think I've heard that theme several times this week, so it's not something I think is new to us, but I can say that there are a lot of operators and service providers who are trying to figure out how would I instantiate these edge cloud instances, because I know the applications are going to need them. And then finally, this idea of the heterogeneous provider ecosystem that we just talked about. So I would be shocked if anybody didn't really already grasp this. This means the innovation of the network's got to drive us forward in four key ways. Programmability. Static networks just are not going to work moving forward. API-driven programmability is not that useful if you don't actually have a control system that can exercise control over the network resources. And it's also not useful if it's done in a proprietary way. So these APIs need to be open, accessible, well understood. And finally, the network needs to be part of a larger infrastructure platform, not just network, but compute platforms and security platforms. So it really has to be orchestrated alongside other parts of the infrastructure. This is going to be our challenge moving forward. It's our call to action, if you will. It's really how do we take this innovation, and I think there's an excellent start to the conversation this week, but I think it's just a conversation now. So I think we're in the early days of how do we put all of this together so we can get from what I was calling here base connectivity services, and I'm probably being more than a little unfair just putting tin cans and string there. There was a lot of very, very good work and very useful output coming out of MEF Carrier Ethernet 2.0, but we have to think bigger than that now. Right? We have to think about a network now that we can have similar control and interfacing not just at the Ethernet layer, but at the IP infrastructure layer, at the wavelength infrastructure layer. Those have to be part of the equation. We have to think about connectivity now, which is scalable and connecting users, devices, and machines. And in particular, the network now connecting systems rather than connecting end-to-end services or unis. We have to make that network now in this digital wave, third digital wave, responsive to algorithmic control and very responsive to application control. So I think we'll see a shift to involve more and more algorithmic control as opposed to human or operator-driven control. And finally, we have to think of the network, as I mentioned, as more than just a networking element of the infrastructure, but as part of what I'm calling here connectivity, where connectivity will give network as a service, it'll give security as a service, it'll give network functions and virtualization as a service. I think those are going to be the important things that are going to take us to the network that delivers on the third digital wave and the digital life. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'll yield the floor.